With so many Ethereum competitors on the market, a chain really needs to go above and beyond to secure that number 2 spot behind Ethereum. And with so many good things being said about Avalanche, could it be the one that will eventually end up there? Stick around and let's talk about it. Hey guys, I'm Sprague, and Avalanche has been on my radar pretty much since its launch when my developer friends started to say good things about it. But for a chain to have attracted this much developer attention and a TVL of nearly $10 billion in just over a year, it must be doing something right. So it's about time that I took a deep dive into AVAX and see what it's all about. But before we get into it, if you're new to my channel, the thing you should know about me is that the only thing I'll shill is myself. So if you want to see more coin deep dives, tech explanations, or general opinions from myself, consider hitting the subscribe button down below. Thanks. The origins of Avalanche start with Team Rocket. No, not that Team Rocket. The pseudo-anonymous group called Team Rocket that published Snowflake to Avalanche on IPFS, first outlining the Avalanche protocol. This paper outlined a group of protocols that, working in conjunction with each other, could create a new protocol that worked better than proof of work while still maintaining the same level of security. Shortly after this paper was released, Amin Gun Sirer would post a link to it on his Twitter saying how big a breakthrough it was. This then led to him starting AvaLabs and eventually co-authoring an update to the paper with Team Rocket with some revisions on that initial paper. To this day, there's been no reveal as to who Team Rocket actually are. However, there is some speculation in the community that Amin is actually part of Team Rocket, and the idea was to try and capture some of that curiosity surrounding Satoshi's anonymity when it comes to Avalanche. Now boasting a team of over 100 engineers, Avalanche has had consistent and steady growth since its mainnet launch on the 1st of September 2020, just a year after that revised white paper was released. But with so many top tier engineers working on it, it's not really hard to see why. On top of this, in 2021, Avalanche held a private token sale, which raised $230 million from venture capital firms and angel investors. The success of this token sale could likely be attributed to the fact that within its first year, Avalanche had over 200 launched projects on it, now up to 350. That's more projects than Solana has overall to date, and more than double what Cardano will have at the end of its first year if it keeps launching projects at the rate it currently is. So given the fact that there wasn't much fanfare right out of the gate for AVAX, and a lot of people hadn't even heard of it until this recent bull run, what's so special about the technology to warrant this level of interest? Well, under the hood, Avalanche has 3 different chains with 3 different purposes. However, all of these chains are tied together by the 4-part Avalanche consensus mechanism. The 4 parts in order are Slush, Snowflake, Snowball, and finally Avalanche. When a transaction is first submitted to the network, it's Slush that determines whether or not that transaction will be allowed or not. Due to the fact that Avalanche is a DAG, transactions aren't assembled into blocks first. The voting happens per each transaction. So in Slush, when a transaction is submitted to the network, the node will then make a decision on whether to allow or deny this transaction. It will then query a subset of nodes on the network and find out what their answers to that transaction are. The response from this subset of nodes is eventually what informs that initial node's decision. For example, if my node was to receive a transaction submission and vote yes on it, and then query 4 other nodes and they all came back with the majority approval, I would leave my vote as it is. However, if when I queried these 4 other nodes, they all came back with disapproval, I would change my vote from a yes to a no. This then repeats over and over again until network consensus has been achieved. Now, unfortunately, this randomness in node selection and voting actually does have a minor drawback, and that's that the vote could, in theory, flip back and forth constantly, remaining at 50-50 forever. And this is where Snowflake comes in. The way this works is that each time a query happens, if the answer that comes back is the same as the one the node is currently voting for, it will increment a counter. However, if the answer that comes back is a different one to the one that the node has voted for, then the counter will reset. Once this counter reaches a certain threshold, the vote will no longer be changed within that node. This means that as more and more votes happen, nodes will start to lock their answers in, which means that while the rest of the network is still deciding on their consensus, there is at least partial consensus across the network. However, this vote memory is extremely short term. If there was no change, add 1 to the counter. If there was a change, reset the counter. Effectively, it only knows what the previous vote was. And this is where Snowball comes in, which effectively augments Snowflake and adds a slightly longer term memory that remembers the confidence level of the voting. Due to the way that randomness works, this means that, for example, a node could have received 8 no votes in a row, even though the wider network consensus was for yes. In this case, the node would have locked in its no answer, even though the general network confidence is actually swaying towards yes. So Snowball is used to smooth out this discrepancy in randomness. And so this is where Avalanche comes in, which aggregates everything that has happened up until this point and determines whether or not that transaction will be written to the DAG or not. So now that we know how the consensus mechanism works, we can dive into the 3 chains, starting with what I think is the most important one, the P chain. Due to the fact that Avalanche is just a consensus protocol, it means it could still fall victim to things like Sybil attacks, which is where one attacker runs multiple nodes on the network. This means that the protocol still needs to be secured using something like proof of work or proof of stake to enforce cryptographic proof. The way that Avalanche does this is using the P chain, which is its proof of stake chain. This means that if you want to stake or take part in consensus on Avalanche, you need to transfer your tokens to the P chain. This chain is effectively the backbone of the security of the entire network. Next, we have the X chain, and Avalanche has decided to take a different approach to a lot of other smart contract chains. Whereas in, say, Ethereum, where simple transactional rules are created in the exact same way that extremely complex smart contract platforms are created, Avalanche instead has its X chain, or exchange chain. This chain works by allowing people to create assets and create conditional rules for the transfer of those assets without needing to create backing smart contracts. This allows the fees on the X chain to be extremely stripped back and fixed because of the fact that there's no extra functionality. It only does exactly what it needs to do. And finally, we have the C chain, which is where Avalanche really comes into its own with a Solidity compliant smart contract chain. It's on this chain that Avalanche has amassed its huge TVL, with some huge names such as Aave, Curve, and SushiSwap all residing there. It's also on this chain that the NFTs on Avalanche reside. Participating in consensus on Avalanche does seem fairly appealing at first, with an 11% yearly return for validators and a 9% yearly return for delegators. However, unfortunately, the bar for entry to actually participate in consensus on Avalanche is extremely high. To become a validator on the Avalanche network, you don't need a super high-powered PC. In fact, you could run the Node software on an old desktop PC that you might have lying around. However, the bar of entry to actually become a validator is 2,000 AVAX. This means the current price to become a validator on Avalanche is $144,000, which is about 1.5 times what it would be to start an ETH 2.0 node. Now, obviously this isn't a sunken cost, because at any time after the first 2 weeks, you can unbond your tokens and sell them off. But it's still an extremely large amount to spend just to become a validator. So most will end up becoming a delegator. However, unlike a lot of other chains that allow you to become a delegator with no minimum token entry, AVAX still requires 25 AVAX tokens to become a delegator, which means that it's going to cost around $1,800 just to participate. For me, this value is just too high for most to be able to participate in consensus unless they bought their tokens in the past at a much lower price. This means that consensus is going to pretty much be driven by old money. Moving on to the token supply and distribution, we see a fairly generic graph where 50% of the tokens have been kept for staking rewards, a combined 20% have gone to the development team and Ava Labs, and the rest have been sold off in multiple public or private sales. The thing to note here though is that if you remove the staking rewards from this graph, it actually seems that Ava Labs owns somewhere between 40 and 60% of the entire token supply, something I'll cover in my concerns section coming up. Unlike a lot of other smart contract chains, Avalanche is actually deflationary, with the transaction fees being burned to offset the minting of new tokens. This, however, could be subject to change using the on-chain governance if it was found that the rate of inflation was too high. In terms of potential upside, it makes sense to compare Avalanche to Ethereum, its logical competitor, and if we do that, we'd end up with one AVAX token being worth $1,170, or around 15 times what it's currently worth. Kicking off my concerns, as I've previously mentioned, I think the bar of entry for consensus is way too high. Most other chains such as Sol, Algo, or Terra have no bar of entry for delegation, which means that anyone can participate in consensus no matter how many tokens they hold. Within the community, however, this isn't really regarded as a negative thing, with many just drawing a comparison between Ethereum's price now and Ethereum's price a few years ago, saying that it's worth paying that bar of entry to be here early. And this is exactly where my problem lies. If we assume that the current participants of consensus want to keep the chain deflationary because it will maximize their own returns on their investment, and we say that Avalanche gets as big as Ethereum, well, now the cost just to be a delegator is $30,000. This results in the only people participating in consensus being old money or the rich, which are two main reasons that people are trying to leave fiat for crypto in the first place. For the on-chain economics not to become extremely top-heavy, not only do these minimum token requirements need to be adjusted over time, but there also needs to be periods of inflation, which is going to be incredibly hard to pass in governance polls when the people who are participating in said governance directly stand to gain from the token being as deflationary as possible. My second concern is just that the user experience of Avalanche right now is not exactly great. With 3 different chains all serving 3 different functions, it's not exactly the easiest thing for a user to participate and use the chain exactly as they want to. Fortunately, this one's easily fixed and there is already strides being made to rectify this with new tooling, and as the ecosystem grows, this will eventually phase out. It's sort of like the early stages of the internet, where everything was kind of confusing until they found ways of abstracting out the complexity for the user experience to improve. But my third concern is the big one, and that's that AVAX's token distribution is awful at best and centralized at worst. As I mentioned, if you remove the staking rewards, the token distribution of AVAX is pretty bad to begin with. However, I'll link an article down below that actually goes into a great length of detail as to how if the Avalanche Foundation are not burning the tokens that they are receiving from staking, then they own nearly 60% of the entire token supply. With the majority of the network being required to pass governance polls, this means the AVAX Foundation effectively has enough tokens to block any proposal they don't like. But why does this matter? Well, the thing is that the Avalanche Foundation have actually already made changes to the protocol without putting it through governance first, in the form of the gas fees. Avalanche decided to reduce the C chain's fees by 50% while leaving the X and P chain's fees exactly as they were, with a view to changing those later. So my problem is that if a governance poll was to come through saying that they wanted to now raise the C chain fees or reduce the X and P chain fees, Avalanche could in theory completely block those governance polls from going through, essentially keeping their vision of Avalanche true. This to me is a pretty big red flag, because it means that actually there's nothing the chain could do to override Avalanche and their decision-making process, effectively putting their trust in a centralized source. As the article points out, Avalanche did not respond to comment on this when they brought it up, which is odd considering that Avalanche are normally extremely fast to respond to any public questioning that they receive. However, unfortunately, this isn't really enough information to condemn them or to decide that this is exactly true. This is all based on speculation and just token analysis. I've obviously had to summarize this article massively because it was really long and extremely in-depth. So as I've said, I'll put a link to it down in my description below so that you can read through the full thing if you want to. Despite this, I think that Avalanche is actually an extremely promising project as long as Ava Labs don't mess it up. To attract this number of developers and to reach that amount of TVL in the short space of time it's done it in is honestly extremely impressive. And as long as they can start streamlining the user experience so it's not just developers who are enjoying the chain, but also casual users as well, there is no limit to what Avalanche is going to be able to achieve. If you enjoyed this video, leave me a like and a comment down below. If I got anything wrong or you disagree with anything I said, also drop it down in the comments below and I'll be sure to respond. If you generally enjoy my content, please do consider subscribing. Thanks, bye.